Alrighty, so I wanted to just do a quick video talk about remote ID really fast because I think a lot of people are over sensationalizing some of the aspects when it comes to remote ID. I don't think that we've done a good enough job of de-escalating concerns, and I don't think the FAA as a whole has done a good job of de-escalating concerns as it pertains to remote ID. I think the biggest concern many people have is their privacy, their identity, and how the information being obtained by these broadcast modules will be used, whether it be against them or by people that could obtain access to this information. And I think that's one of the biggest question marks. But with that being said, with all of that being out there and as a question mark right now, because realistically it is, until this rolls out and becomes effective on the 16th of September, we won't know how this is actually going to play out. And I'm sure as the months go by, we're probably going to hear stories, some stories good, some stories not so good, but we just won't know. Me personally, all of my aircrafts are compliant with remote ID because I use DJI drones, or I have Autel drones that already have remote ID built in. So for me, it's not even going to be like a thought process of whether or not I am compliant. My aircrafts will be compliant. And because outside of YouTube, I do 107 work every single day, 7 days a week, I'm typically in the air for monetary gain. It's just one of those things. I will be compliant. I don't have the luxury to say I'm not going to be compliant. I don't have the luxury of saying that. I could do that, but to what point? I mean, I'm flying a DJI drone that's already going to be compliant. So, and even if I'm not going to be compliant, I wouldn't say it just simply because I'm not going to make myself a fish in the barrel. And I see a lot of people making these videos, and I know they think that this is a really cool thing to say because some influencer told you to not comply and F remote ID, and that's the way to go. But the reality is all you're doing is creating a barrel. You're creating a barrel, pouring in the water and hopping in there and making it really easy to pick you out if you are not going to be compliant. There's an old saying called say less. And that's what I would recommend for many of you. If you don't plan on being compliant, you're going to fly and you're going to fly under the radar until you figure things out within how remote ID is actually going to operate. Say less. Just don't be compliant, but you don't have to say it. That's my best advice to many. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I'm going to do with my quads. I have probably 8 or 9 quads, and if I have to buy a remote ID module for each of those concurrently right now, the modules are about $300. That's more than an air unit at this point. I don't see myself affixing, a module to each quad unless I can program each, quad to have like their own identifier on the same module and have one module. I don't know. I'm also concerned about the weight of these modules. And yes, I saw that Drone Tag had a module available that was really small. It looks unique, it looks interesting, but that's just one more thing we have to wire up. I really still feel like areas where we should be fighting back is number one, sheltered operations. I think that most of us that fly FPV qualify for sheltered operations within the US, they do not acknowledge. The FAA does not acknowledge sheltered operations, which I believe they need to. Because if you're below the tallest tree line, you're out of the realm of any aircraft, whether it be drone delivery, helicopter, small manned aircraft, it doesn't matter. You're not an immediate threat to anything. And I think that is something that we need to be pushing for and fighting for in the future Reauthorization Act, which will be coming up in a couple of years, is the fight for sheltered operations, which should have been a fight the previous Reauthorization Act, and I don't know why it wasn't. Another thing that I think a lot of you forget is this was proposed 3 years ago. We had a comment window in which we could express our concerns and opinions, and 54,000 of us expressed our concerns and opinions for remote ID. Now, with that being said, 873,000 people are registered as remote pilots or drone owners here in the United States. 873,000. By those numbers, by that math, only 6% or less than 6% of us actually voiced concern in regards to remote ID, whether or not it was just information or the ability to know, or maybe some of these people that fly drones just aren't into it like like how we would assume people that fly drones are, doesn't matter, but only 54,000 of us expressed concerns. And I think that some of the larger organizations did an amazing job. FPV Freedom Coalition definitely did amazing. You have the flight test community that did amazing for us. And of course you have the AMA, which they always have their hand out, but they seem to do the least. I digress. But there were some small things changed with the initial proposal, like they wanted cellular connectivity and we didn't get that. We pushed back, we complained. They dropped the cellular connectivity option for what we have now. Now, as we get closer to the date, that 16th of September, there's a good chance that it could be pushed back yet again, because as we are going, there are still more and more loopholes being discovered in their whole process. Not only are there loopholes, but the fact is that there aren't very many remote ID modules available. Even 2 years later after that initial rollout, there's very limited modules that are at an affordable cost. And if it is not affordable, people aren't going to even consider getting their drones compliant. And then thus creates mass non-compliancy. With whether you say you're not going to be compliant or not, they realize that that is a potential problem. The reality is the FAA doesn't have the manpower to sort of go through and micromanage everybody, whether or not they are going to be flying compliant or not. They just don't have the ability to do that. And even if they did, it's a civil matter and not a criminal matter in that instance, meaning that if you don't fly in compliance, you're not going to jail. It's not like they can come and arrest you, do anything of that order. I mean, yeah, I guess they could essentially collaborate with local law enforcement, but again, not having the manpower to do certain tasks is limiting. And the FAA has probably one of the most limited task forces out there out of all the government agencies, if I'm just being clear. So much so that they rely on volunteers when it comes to the drone space. The drone aspect for the FAA is 100% an afterthought for them. It's something that ended up, sort of blowing up exponentially, and they were forced, their hands were forced to try to figure out regulations. This was an afterthought. Remote ID, drones, this is all an afterthought. This was something that developed so much faster than they were able to actually handle. And that's why they utilize drone pros and like volunteers to be able to help mitigate some of this traffic that they get, which I also think is a bunch of bullshit since they don't pay these drone pros, that it's just a volunteer position. And it's one of the reasons why I don't support that and I won't have anything to do with it whatsoever. Doesn't mean I don't respect the ones that do it, but I just personally won't or don't feel like I want to have anything to do with it because my time is very valuable. And well, there's that. Anyways, but that being said, I'm going to be compliant, and as far as, my FPV drones, I'll figure out that as I go. I'm monitoring, what these things cost to try to get them in compliance. But in some instances, I may figure out that, hey, I may have to downgrade my fleet a little bit and maybe even reduce the number of quads that I have, because I have like 6 or 7 quads currently that I would need to get compliant. And if I can't find a module that can basically be attached or affixed to all of them, then I couldn't potentially make them compliant. Again, keep in mind, I'm not somebody who necessarily flies as a hobbyist. I fly for hire for companies. So for me, it's not like more or less I can't, it's a necessity to keep things compliant. And there's a lot of people like me that have to do it because, we're making money doing this, and you shouldn't chastise those that are going to do something versus that don't. Like I said, if you're not going to be compliant, don't be compliant. It's your choice. There's no right or wrong, and you're not winning any awards. And at the end of all this, whether you don't comply or you push back or whoever pushes back the hardest, you're not going to get like another merit badge. I mean, nobody gives a fuck. So do whatever it is that you want to do. That's just my opinion on this. Like I said, my opinion may not be ideal to many, but that's just my opinion. And I just don't feel like the hysteria and the over sensationalism around remote ID is really necessarily warranted. We've known about this for 3 years. Don't wait until the last minute to now try to turn a ship that's heading straight for an iceberg. I mean, doesn't turn very fast. All right, that's going to do it. I'll see you in the next video. Stay original.